Let's talk Aetherdrift in the context of Modern. My number one pick, the card that I think is going to be the most impactful to the format from the set, is Ketramos the New Dawn. Finally, Simic is not the color combination that gets the broken 3-drop. This is the first ever Orzhov broken 3-mana spell. The card kind of does it all. It's a 3-mana 4/4, Menace, Lifelink, Indestructible, all amazing keywords. And it says whenever one or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, so only on your turn, not opponent's turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. However, this ability can trigger as many times a turn as you want. This is not a once a turn trigger card. However, this card does have a pretty big downside. It cannot attack or block unless there are seven or more cards in exile, but the card advantage ability is immediately online. And the main thing that's so exciting about this card advantage ability is that it works really well with a lot of existing Modern staples. In fact, Ketramos is coming to the Modern format at the first time ever where an Orzhov mid-range deck is top tier. There's an Orzhov Flicker deck that plays Ephemerate, Solitude, Overlord, Felia. Ketramos is great with all of these cards. That is already top of the metagame, and Ketramos is going to slot into it pretty well. However, I think you're going to need to make some adjustments to really utilize this card to the best of its abilities. When you Ephemerate a creature, the Ephemerate exiles any creature, it comes back down, you draw a card, lose a life. If you Ephemerate a Solitude, you get to draw a card from Ephemerating it, then you get to exile a creature of theirs, you get to, that's 2 cards you get to draw. On the rebound, 2 more cards. When you evoke a card to Solitude, that's exiling a card from your hand. That's not the battlefield. You don't get a card from that. Whenever you attack with Ophelia, you get to exile something. That's another card. Overlord of the Baelmerk, not as direct synergy with Ketramos, but what's really cool about Overlord is that it's going to mill your graveyard for a lot. So if you happen to do something like main deck Relic of Progenitus, this will be a way for you to quickly get that 7 cards in exile for Ketramos to just be online as a lifelinker. And I do think you want to be able to attack and block with Ketramos pretty quickly so that lifelink can compensate for the life loss on the card itself. The card is only 3 mana. It can draw a lot of cards every single turn. It can gain you a bunch of life back to compensate for the life loss. And it is also an indestructible card advantage engine, kind of like the One Ring, which is recently banned. I think this card is going to be a big player in the format. I think it's probably only going to go into the existing Black-White Blink deck, but it would be really cool if you could find an extra spot for this card to find a home in. One cool interaction is with Serum Powder. If you Serum Powder at all, you have 7 cards in exile, so Ketramos will always come down on turn 3, able to attack and block. Don't think that this is that important or good, but I think it is a pretty fun interaction I wanted to talk about. But I think this card's going to be a banger in a deck that is already really good in Modern. Another card that I think will be a great addition to an already existing mid-rangey white deck in the Modern format is Bright Glass Gearhulk. This is a 4-mana 4/4 first strike trample. When it enters, you may search your library for up to 2 artifact, creature, and or enchantment cards with mana value 1 or less, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. I think this card is going to slot really perfectly into the green-white ritual deck that I like to play. There's been a lot of players who've had good results with this archetype. Kind of simply put, this is a 4-mana 4/4 that can put in a Guide of Souls and an Ocelot Pride into your hand. This is a lot of card advantage, and if you were to ever flicker the Bright Glass Gearhulk with a Ephemerate or a Felia, you get to just get more and more Guides and Prides to just flood the board. Additionally, Gearhulk can grab really impactful sideboard cards, like Deafening Silence, Tormod's Crypt, Pithing Needle, Haywire Might. There's going to be more. And so you get to kind of adjust your sideboard a little bit with the card too. And I really think that with Ketramos coming to the Modern format and like the way that the Mir and the Boros decks are evolving, like Boros with Showdown of the Scald, specifically Boros with Wrath of the Skies, we're kind of entering a Modern format where just having like banger 3 and 4 mana card advantage spells is really important to have. And when I've been playing the green-white ritual deck, that has been something that I've been missing. This has been a pretty different dynamic from the more like combo versus Boros metagame we were seeing a few months ago. And so I think Gearhulk is going to be like a great upgrade for this archetype. I'm really excited to play probably 2, maybe start off with 3 in the main deck and then go from there. It does pitch to Endurance and Solitude too, so if you're playing a bunch of those in the main deck, you can afford to play more copies of a card like this. Continuing with the theme of powerful upgrades to existing Modern decks, we've got Marauding Mako, a card that is going to be, I think, a very big deal for the Hollow 1 deck. Marauding Mako is a 1-mana 1/1 Shark Pirate that says whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put that many +1 counters on this creature. And it also cycles for 2 mana, which is a pretty big deal on a 1-mana creature. So if you top deck it late, you can cycle into something more impactful. And I really would like to highlight that this card says whenever you discard one or more cards, put that many counters on this creature. This feels like a really big break from the kind of cards, we've been seeing designed in standard for the last 2 or 3 years. Playing these kind of cards very safe. A lot of times a card like this would say only triggers once a turn. A lot of times cards like this would say put only one counter. No. If you cast 2 Burning Inquiries on a Marauding Mako on turn 2, this thing is a 7/7. You cast Goblin Lore Street Wraith, this thing is a 6/6. You play in Flashback Faithless Looting, that's 4 more counters. This card can get really out of control really quickly, and I really would also like to highlight that this is a powerful, quick threat in the Hollow One deck that does not rely on the graveyard like Nethergoyf does. And the more of these like non-graveyard reliant threats that you play, like Hollow One, like Morocco, maybe Flameblade Adept, you just played both of them, the better the Hollow One deck is, because this is like one of the main weaknesses. If your opponent plays Layla on turn 1, a lot of your cards are turned off. The more cards like this you play, the more resilient your very, very fast aggro deck is. I'd also like to just take a look at Crypt Caller Chariot, a card that usually I wouldn't look too closely at, but they did just unban Faithless Looting. This card is a 4-mana 5/5 vehicle. Whenever you discard one or more cards, make that many tapped zombie tokens. This also has no restriction on triggering per turn, and if you discard any number of cards, you get that many zombies. If you play in Flashback of Faithless Looting with this in play, you get 8 zombies. And again, this is just not the kind of card usually I would take that closer look at, but I do think Modern is becoming more and more about these kind of big haymaker cards. And so I want to take a look at this card in like Faithless Looting, maybe Underworld Cookbook decks. I think it could be a pretty powerful 1 or 2 of top end in some strategies. There was a lot of hype for the Artifact Planeswalker, and I actually think it's pretty good. The Aether Spark is a 4-mana Artifact Planeswalker equipment that says as long as the Aether Spark is attached to a creature, it can't be attacked, and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalties on the Aether Spark. Now, the fact that this is a Planeswalker that almost all the time can't be attacked is a really big deal, and the fact that it's a 4-mana Planeswalker that can be cheated into play with Stoneforge Mystic is also a pretty big deal. The abilities on Aether Spark I think are pretty good too. It's always going to +1 when it comes down. The +1 on Aether Spark attaches it to a creature you control, and you get to put a counter on that creature. And something that's maybe a little bit not intuitive about this card is you don't get extra loyalty on the Aether Spark when you deal combat damage to a player. It's just combat damage. So say you put a +1 counter on your Esper Sentinel and you attack and you trade with a Johnny 2/1 token, you get 2 extra loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. So that's going to put it from 5 to 7. And then you're maybe just free next turn to minus it, drawing 2 cards, and then sort of just snowballing and generating some advantage. Of course, this on a 4-mana spell, a little bit undercosted, but really the Aether Spark I think is going to shine as like a powerful card advantage tool off of your Stoneforge Mystic. And I think it's also kind of cool that in theory, you're drawing a bunch of cards off of it with the -5, and then you're hitting your opponent with bigger and bigger creatures that maybe you're buffing with Stoneforge Mystic, and then maybe you get to -10 to add 10 mana of any one color to play all of these cards. I think that this will come up less often, but it's going to take some time to kind of play test the play pattern. But I have some hopes for like fair Stoneforge Mystic shells to come back with the Aether Spark. Maybe something most people won't want to hear is that the best Stoneforge Mystic shells are going to be Black White Blink or Boros Synergy, because those are just the best white creature decks. I think this is unlikely to make Hammer Time a competent or powerful strategy, but I would love to be wrong about that. I would love to see the Aether Spark maybe make Hammer a bit more playable. It probably doesn't make it less playable, I'll tell you that. But I think this is a step in the right direction for fair Stoneforge strategies in Modern, and I am keeping my fingers crossed. Monument to Endurance is a really cool grindy 3-mana artifact that I'm excited to try to build around. It says whenever you discard a card, choose one that has not been chosen this turn. Draw a card, make a treasure token, and each opponent loses 3 life. I think this is going to be a pretty interesting card advantage tool in decks that are playing Faithless Looting, Street Wraith, Cookbook, Goblin Engineer. Notably, I think this is one of the only, if not the only, like kind of playable 3-mana card advantage artifact that just stays in play and you can sort of build around over the course of a few turns. Monument to Endurance seems like it also can go pretty crazy in multiples if you can get 2 of these into play. You discard a card, you get to draw 2, and then this is going to let you make treasure token, which gives you more mana to also like make your opponent lose 6. It can potentially threaten your opponent pretty quickly. Now, this kind of card is going to be a lot better against non-big mana decks, non-combo decks, but I think that it is going to be powerful enough and resilient enough that I'm excited to try it. Another big thing about this card is that you're going to be able to trigger it the turn it comes down a lot of the time with 0 mana discard effects like Street Wraith and Cookbook, which means that if your opponent is ready to deal with it with like a Besage You or Haywire Might, you can just discard in response to that activation and 2-for-1 them by getting to draw a card. We also have Marketback Walker, which was my preview card, something that I think is going to be a pretty big upgrade for the Hardened Scales archetype. It's a XX artifact creature like Hangerback Walker or Walking Ballista. It enters with X counters on it. You can spend 4 mana to put a counter on it, like Walking Ballista. And it says, when this creature dies, just simply draw a card for each counter on it. This, quite simply, also pairs really well with Hardened Scales to double the counters. Sack outlets like Arcbound Ravager and Zabaz that both let you sack your Walker for cards and also put counters to the Walker to draw a lot of cards. It also pairs, I think, particularly well with Phyrexian Tower, where Tower lets you sack something else for mana to play a bigger Walker, and then sack the Walker to draw a lot of cards, and then you have a lot of cards to use that extra mana on. I'm pretty excited for it. I think this kind of like big card draw spell that you no longer have access to because the One Ring is banned is really important for a deck like Hardened Scales to compete in a format with lots of efficient sweepers like Wrath of Skies, and I am optimistic that this will put Hardened Scales back on the map. Repurposing Bay is maybe the most exciting build around coming from Aetherdrift, and it's also coming at a really ideal time because they just unbanned Mox Opal. You know, there was a time when they printed Oswald Fiddlebender and called it the Artifact Birthing Pod, and as someone who's probably played more Oswald Fiddlebender in Modern than anybody else, I can tell you that building your deck around a 2-mana 2/2 really stinks sometimes, where you just kind of put all of these like lower card quality cards in your deck to set up to play your 2-mana 2/2 to sack them, and your opponent just kills it. Repurposing Bay, being a 3-mana artifact, is just a lot more resilient to removal, and because it's an artifact, you can activate it the turn it comes down. You don't have to wait for that pesky summoning sickness. In fact, you're going to be able to play this card and activate it on turn 2 if you can go like turn 1 Enigma Jewel, turn 2 Mox Opal, Artifact Land, Repurposing Bay, then you can sack your Jewel or your Opal into something kind of impactful here. And I think that that's kind of the problem with Repurposing Bay, but it's also part of the fun and trying to figure this card out is what are you going to do with it? I think there's kind of 2 directions you can go, and it's possible you could overlap these strategies, but you could either be more of a controlling shell where you're like turning your Mox Opals into like card draw spells like Chromatic Star or Ichor Wellspring, or you're getting like removal spells like Portable Hole, or you're getting like the new 3-mana Artifact O-Ring that I didn't put on the slide, but it's not very exciting. It's just an Artifact O-Ring. Or you can get like Ensnaring Bridge, lock pieces, this kind of stuff. You could also try to go a little bit bigger and like Thought Monitor and the Sundering Titan. And for all of you who I'd said don't do that with Fiddlebender, I'm telling you it's different here. One, you're in blue, Repurposing Bay gets activated immediately, you don't have to wait for Summoning Sickness, it's just a lot more resilient. It's different this time. I think you might actually be able to do the really cool thing of like Thought Monitor and the Sundering Titan with Repurposing Bay. So I think there's a very good chance I'll be trying either both plans or a combination of the two pretty early, but this is definitely going to be one of the more fun cards, I think. Here we have 2 vehicles that are pretty clear references to powerful 1-mana creatures in other Magic the Gathering formats. We've got the Last Ride, which is a pretty clear reference to Death Shadow. 1-mana, 13/13, gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. You also have a little bit of extra text here. Pay 3 mana, pay 2 life, draw a card. This is pretty nice, especially if you're playing a Death Shadow style strategy that's playing a lot of interaction, counter spells, removal spells, blah blah blah. Being able to like just sit back, hold up a counter spell, draw a card, not super powerful, but it is a pretty nice upside. But the big upgrade to Last Ride over the card Death Shadow, which admittedly has not seen a lot of play in Modern recently, is that you can cast a card on turn 1. And really, in a lot of ways, this is an upside that compensates for Death Shadow's biggest downside. Death Shadow is a 1-mana creature that you can almost never play on turn 1. Please don't actually me with like, what if you have 3 Street Wraiths? You can basically never play Death Shadow turn 1. The fact that you can play this card turn 1 and, go like Fetch Shock, Last Ride, turn 2, Thoughtseize, take a removal spell, Street Wraith, Fetch Shock, play a creature, crew the Last Ride. I think this is going to be pretty interesting. Is this going to make Death Shadow style strategies a competitive strategy in Modern? I think probably not, but I think this is a really big step in the right direction. And then kind of on the other side of this, in this little mini cycle, we have Voyager Glidecar, which is a reference to Warden of the Inner Sky. This is a 1 mana 2/3 when it enters Scry 1, and you can tap 3 other untapped creatures or vehicles you control. Sorry, 3 other untapped creatures you control. So I guess much worse because you can't tap artifacts. But until end of turn, it becomes a flying vehicle, and you put a counter on it. So compared to Warden of the Inner Sky, you can't tap like clue tokens and stuff. This kind of stinks. But it immediately becomes a 4 toughness creature. So it just can't be bolted, which is a pretty big deal. And it immediately is a 3/4 flyer if you tap the 3 things, which is also a pretty big deal too. And I definitely see this card being something I want to put into my Collector Cage deck. If you haven't seen it, I've been playing this mono white Collector's Cage deck that plays Windbrisk Heights and Collector's Cage to try to cast really big stuff like Emrakul. Sometimes I'll play Cavalier of Gales over Emrakul if I have like Force of Virtue to pitch it out of my hand. You play like a Mary's Call as a land, or you can cast it to get 2 4/4s. And that deck is very artifact focused. It plays Mox Opal. This is a cheap artifact to turn on. Mox Opal, you play a lot of cheap Ornithopter's Midnights to like tap and like get counters for Voyager Glidecar or Warden of the Inner Sky. And I think this will be a really nice upgrade to that deck. I think the deck's just kind of nice in general. It is kind of weak to Wrath the Skies, but pretty fast, pretty consistent. My personal favorite card from the set is Duretti Rocketeer Engineer. I think this card rules. It's a mono red Trash for Treasure Titan. A 5 mana star 5, power equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. And like a Titan, when it enters or attacks, you can choose an artifact card in your graveyard. You can sacrifice an artifact and return that card to the battlefield. So what's really cool about this card compared to Trash for Treasure, which is admittedly 3 less mana, is that you can cast Trash for Treasure twice with it the turn it comes down because of Arena of Glory. You know, this is something I've been saying a lot, is that with Arena of Glory being in Modern, you kind of have to think of every creature that could be hasted with Arena of Glory just as having haste. Just think how crazy would this card be if it had haste? And the answer is I think pretty crazy. Just being able to come down, sacrifice, your Mox Opal that you use to power this out on turn 4 or whatever to get back a Sundering Titan, get that ETB trigger, attack, maybe sack the Sundering Titan, destroy more of their lands, get something else back, get an ETB effect from Portal to Phyrexia, something like that. It seems really, really cool to me. Really, really cool to me. And the fact that it's on like a pretty beefy creature too, I think is also pretty nice. In fact, with Arena of Glory, if you get back a Portal to Phyrexia or a Sundering Titan, not only are you generating a lot of value, but you're dealing a lot of damage. And I would be a little bit like more concerned playing a 5 mana artifact, 5 mana creature in Modern if they didn't just unban Mox Opal. When you compare this to like the competitiveness of like an artifact graveyard strategy like Breach is probably going to be the better deck, but this is going to be cooler. And they still didn't really give us anything super powerful to Trash for Treasure back into play. That was one, just as a side note, something I was really hoping from the set, that we would get something really cool and big to cheat into play. And there's kind of something we'll talk about later, but for the most part, we just kind of still don't have that thing. Continuing with the audio technician on an 80s rock band theme, we've got Transit Mage. The next in the Trinket Mage cycle, everybody knows Trinket Mage gets a 0 or 1. Everyone knows Treasure Mage gets something bigger. There's a few more that I can't remember. And this one is maybe the last one in the cycle. It can get a 4 or 5 mana value artifact to put into your hand. I must admit, when I first saw this card, my heart immediately went to, I can get a Golos or I can get a Timeless Lotus off of it, but I think I need to kind of abandon that idea. But I do actually think Transit Mage slots into a pretty good Modern deck. Mono Blue Belcher, maybe the most underplayed deck in Modern these days. But what Transit Mage does is just 3 mana, put a Goblin Char Belcher into your hand. Maybe you have a Lotus Bloom coming down next turn, and you can just play Belcher next turn, play your Lotus Bloom and win the game. Or maybe you have to wait till turn 5, but it's good that it tutors your marquee card while also giving you another non-token blue creature to sacrifice to Flare of Denial. I think this is kind of a cool, powerful 2-for-1. Works really well with the flares that you're already playing. And if I was like a mono blue Belcher main, I would probably try playing like 2 Transit Mages at first and then see, do you want to go down to 1? Maybe go down to 0. Do you want to go up to 3? But I think this is kind of an interesting flex spot for the archetype. Intimidation Tactics is a power crept Dreams of Steel and Oil. And you might be wondering, Dreams of Steel and Oil in Modern? And if you're wondering that, you're kind of out of touch. Dreams of Steel and Oil has just kind of proven itself to be a pretty good modern discard spell. I think kind of overtaking, at least in my mind, Inquisition of Kozilek for the most part. Target opponent reveals their hand. You can choose an artifact or creature from it and exile that card. Kind of simply put, being able to exile a card is a really big deal in like the Flage, Emrakul the Promised End, Unearth, Worldbreaker format. Just ends up being a super powerful thing. It does have a downside from Dreams of Steel and Oil. Dreams of Steel and Oil can choose to exile a different card besides the one that you take, or if there's nothing to take, you can still exile something from the graveyard. That is sometimes a pretty big deal, but usually it's not that important. I do think Intimidation Tactics is better because it has cycling. And cycling for 3 mana, it's definitely a lot. Definitely a lot. But, one really big dynamic of discard spells in Magic the Gathering is that they're really good early. They not only can greatly disrupt your opponent's game plan, but they also give you really good information about how to sequence your turns. Kind of basic stuff, right? Big downside of discard spells is if you top deck them in the late game, it's just a dead draw. So the more discard spells you play, the worse your late game is usually. The fact that this has cycling, this is the first time we're seeing like a really playable discard spell that just has cycling. And, if you're playing this in like a Cabal Coffers deck, which is one spot I really like Dreams of Steel and Oil, because it doesn't lose life, is you're going to probably just have a lot of mana to cycle through it. And just having better top decks in a big mana deck like that, I think is a really big deal. It's early, but Intimidation Tactics could end up just being a modern staple. If I had to like guess, I would say I think it just will be. I'm like really high on this card, but it is hard to evaluate cycling 3. Three is a lot of mana, but it's hard to overstate like how interesting and exciting cycling on a discard spell is for me. There are a handful of affinity cards in the new set. The one I think is the best is Demonic Junker. This one is a 7 mana affinity card, kind of comparable to Thought Monitor because they both cost 7. When it enters, you can destroy up to 1 creature each player controls. So a powerful, potentially efficient removal spell that's a 2-for-1 in your affinity deck is cool because that archetype typically can struggle to deal with big creatures, especially if you're more of like a blue-black build, playing blue-black for like Basim, Psychic Frog. It's also kind of interesting. You can kill your own thing, just like a small upside, but if you have like a Ornithopter or a Midnight that's not doing anything, you can just destroy it and then make your Demonic Junker a 6/5 instead of a 4/3, which I think could be kind of cool, just like a little small upside. You also have Voyage Home, which is 7 mana, same casting cost, draw 3 cards, gain 3 life. This card is a bit weirder because it's always going to be at least 2 mana compared to Junker, which sometimes can be 1 mana. I will say most of the times these 7 mana cost cards, you're playing them for like 3 mana on turn 3. It's pretty rare they're like 1 mana early. It is also kind of hard to overstate how many more cards 3 is than 2. I know this is kind of sounds very simple, maybe sounds kind of dumb, but 3 cards is 50% more cards than 2. And your ability to draw 3 will let you chain stuff together potentially in a really powerful way. Life gain on card draw spells is also pretty potent. So this is one I'm having a hard time evaluating. I think that it's probably going to be worse than Thoughtcast most of the time, just because Thoughtcast is like a lot of times 1 mana on turn 2. But it could just be the case that this card is a banger. Just keep an eye out for it. Just keep an open mind. Play test with this card, Demonic Junker. Just keep an open mind. Maybe Esper Affinity could just be a good way to go. I also like this card, Memory Guardian. This is a 1 mana 3/4 flyer. It's also an artifact itself when you compare this to the old school Somber Hover Guard, which was a 6 mana 3/2, not an artifact. This card's significantly better because it costs 5 mana. This can a lot of times be a turn 2, occasionally turn 1, I guess. 1 mana 3/4 flyer. And I don't think that the aggro builds of Affinity are particularly good, but Memory Guardian I think can be a good step in the right direction. 4 toughness matters a lot. I don't really love that it doesn't block a flying Guide of Souls very well, but a 3 power flyer is also like particularly relevant in Modern because it pressures a Johnny pretty well. So I like this card, but I don't really like the aggro Affinity decks as much as I like these more interactive Affinity decks. Okay, Radiant Lotus is a pretty crazy card. 6 mana, tap. Sacrifice one or more artifacts, choose a color. Target player adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. Simply put, this can make a ton of mana the turn it comes down. Sacrifices itself to make 3. The next artifact is mana neutral, and then each artifact after that is just a Black Lotus. You can do a lot of pretty interesting stuff with it. You can just sacrifice all of your artifacts, then cast Faith's Reward, bring everything back, loop Faith's Reward somehow. These eggs decks always kind of like, I'm not a big eggs fan. For those who don't know, eggs is refers to like sacking little stars and spheres and drawing a bunch of cards and Faith's Rewarding and then winning in like the most annoying way possible. But this could be a pretty interesting way to play this Faith's Reward strategy. I also think it's kind of cool that Shifting Woodland allows you to do the Radiant Lotus thing while being a lot less weak to counter spells. Maybe you're playing it in like a Duretti Trash for Treasure Shell, and you are able to just Shifting Woodland your Radiant Lotus instead of having to play your 6-drop against the counter spell, especially in the Consigned to Memory format. And then you can activate your Radiant Lotus. Maybe you can even like loop your Shifting Woodland with something like Lumra, Aftermath Analyst. It's probably weird to overlap that with Radiant Lotus, but the Woodland is really good with cards like these, and I think this is something that's kind of interesting to explore. Also could potentially be good in these Duretti decks. Hard to say, but it also can do a little bit of what Karn Clan Ironworks did. 2 more mana, theoretically 1-time use, although you could try to loop this card, and potentially you can like Radiant Lotus away like Scrap Trawler, Mirror Retriever stuff, similar to how Ironworks did. I'm going to work on it. I really like artifact combo decks in Modern. I don't think I've ever really built around a 6 mana engine like this. I've done some 5 mana engines. 6 is tough. I will do my very best, but I don't have the highest hopes for this card at the moment. But there are definitely a lot of angles, and I'm not going to give up on my first try. Dredger's Insight might be a card that would be kind of easy to overlook if Malevolent Rumble just hadn't shown how powerful an effect like this can be. Kind of very similar effect, 2 mana, sorcery speed. When it enters, mill four cards, and you can put an artifact, creature, or land from among them into your hand. So compare this to Malevolent Rumble, which can get mills 4, but can get any permanents. You're not going to be able to get Planeswalkers. You're not going to be able to get enchantments, so you can't get itself. This is something, although Rumble can't get Rumble. But like Malevolent Rumble comes with a spawn token, Dredger's Insight says, whenever 1 or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard, gain 1 life. So I think this card is going to be specifically interesting in the Yawgmoth deck, where if you're looping Young Wolf with a Yawgmoth, or in theory another Sec Outlet, but always Yawgmoth really, the life gain from Dredger's Insight is going to offset the life loss from Yawgmoth. So Yawgmoth plus Young Wolf, or plus any other Undying creature just gives you, and you just get to draw as many cards as you want, free of life loss, until you're able to, Court of Calling for your Blood Artist, or however you're choosing to win these days. Shout out Obelisk Spider. I think that, Malevolent Rumble is also a card that you already want to play in Yawgmoth. And so this has already been one big problem with the Yawgmoth archetype, is that you have so many tools to play with, and figuring out the correct list is very difficult to do. I would even be kind of surprised if any Yawgmoth player right now felt like their list was definitely optimal, because there are just so many tools you can play with. Birthing Ritual, Malevolent Rumble, how many Shifting Woodlands is correct, how many Green Sun Zeniths is correct, and how many Dryad Arbors. Like, I even see some people talk about 2 Dryad Arbors. I don't know about that, but like, there's even like other like cards that a lot of people dismiss, like Flare of Cultivation and Chthonian Nightmare. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on with Yawgmoth, and now we have another thing. So good luck, Yawgmoth players. I probably will not be starting working on this, but I will say if no one else does it, I will. Aetherdrift's cutest card, District Mascot, a 1 mana 0/0 that enters with a counter, or 2 counters if you have a Hardened Scales on it. And it has a pretty cool ability. You can remove 2 counters from the mascot to destroy an artifact. Not artifact or enchantment, just an artifact. And when it attacks while saddled, you can put a counter on it. So I think there's a pretty good play pattern here, where you play a Scales, then you play a mascot, has 2 counters on it, then any creature saddles it, because it saddles 1, and you get to put 2 counters on the mascot. And so against artifact decks, you can just kind of have your opponent locked out. with this card with the hardened scales. You just get to destroy an artifact every single turn, which I think is pretty cool. It also is beyond that, like in games where you care less about destroying artifacts, can just be a really big beefy creature. Now, I don't think that this card will do much more than just be like a obscure sideboard card for scales. Maybe Haywire might just always ends up being the better card, but it's also cool that this ability here is cauldronable, and it is like potentially a more potent ability than Haywire's Might's ability because you can get more equity off of one creature with it. So shout out Hardened Scales players, you got 2 cards from the set. Another green disenchant creature, Webstrite Elite. I'm having kind of a hard time evaluating this card. It's a 2-mana 3/3 reach, so not insane stats, but like pretty solid. You're mostly going to think of the 2-mana 3/3 reach as the other option on this card. The main option, I think, is green X cycle. And when you cycle it, you can destroy up to 1 artifact or enchantment with mana value X. So this is going to be a good 2-for-1 disenchant against low mana value artifacts and enchantments. The big one, of course, that comes to mind is Urza Saga. This is just 2 mana, kill Urza Saga, draw a card. That can be like 3 mana, kill Amulet of Vigor, draw a card. That can also occasionally just be a threat if your opponent hasn't played into your disenchant. So it's also an insect, which is a little bit relevant for Grist. Don't go too crazy. One thing I don't like about this card though is like if you green sun for it, you can't disenchant anything. Kind of minor. We have Sky Seer's Chariot, which is just kind of obscure Pithing Needle variant. I do kind of like this card. It's a 2-mana 3/3 flying vehicle, so this is a disruptive sideboard card that can also pressure your opponents. And being able to pressure your opponents with your Pithing Needle is pretty big, since a lot of times you're like mulliganing for cards that turn off your opponent's plan, but then you just give them a lot of time to draw out of it. Instead of just being a true Pithing Needle, though, you come down, you choose a non-land card name, like I guess Phyrexian Revoker, because you can name lands with Pithing Needle, and it says activated abilities of the chosen card name cost 2 more to activate. So what's cool about this is that you can also shut off mana abilities, unlike Pithing Needle, but like Phyrexian Revoker. So against like Belcher, you probably want to name Lotus Bloom instead of Belcher because a 5 mana to activate Belcher is not that good, but a Lotus Bloom that only makes 1 mana, kind of weak. Naming Grinding Station turns it off. Naming Yawgmoth can be really good. So it's got a lot of targets in the format. I think that I probably would still be playing Pithing Needle over this card most of the time, but it could just be the case that the extra pressure on a card like this ends up being a really big deal. So keep your eye on it, and maybe people who play Death and Taxes style strategies would have more insight on this card than I would. So I mentioned earlier that one thing I really wanted from the set was a really powerful artifact to shape anew into. Shape anew is a really powerful card. It says the controller of target artifacts sacrifices it, then you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card, and you put that card onto the battlefield. This card is really powerful because it combines well with Gingerbread Cabin. Gingerbread Cabin is the green land from the Eldraine cycle. When you control 3 or more other forests and there's untapped, makes a food token. And kind of like how Creativity uses the dwarf tokens to put Archon of Cruelty into play, you can use Shape Anew on a Gingerbread Cabin token to put an artifact into play. And there's 2 really big advantages of doing this over Creativity. The biggest one, I think, is that you don't open yourself up to creature removal on your token. A food token that doesn't die to lightning bolt is a lot better than a dwarf token that does, kind of simply put. Additionally, when you play Shape Anew, you can play creatures in your deck. You can play any creature you want that's not an artifact creature, and have that kind of early game pressure, and then still be able to cheat something big into play. We've played a lot of Shape Anew decks over the years, or some Shape Anew decks over the years, and the big problem is, despite this card being in theory powerful, in practice there just really isn't anything super efficient, super powerful to cheat into play. There are some cards that are situationally good, like Sundering Titan, Phyrexian Portal, God Pharaoh's Gift, but nothing that just is kind of good against everything. Like how Archon of Cruelty is just kind of, it's an Uro Croxa, just kind of good all the time. The best thing we got from this set for Shape Anew, I think, is Pyrewood Gear Hulk. You can't really say that Radiant Lotus is a good thing for Shape Anew, because Radiant Lotus requires you to play a lot of artifacts. So unless you're making a lot of food tokens, you couldn't Shape Anew into this consistently. The best thing we got is Pyrewood Gear Hulk. a 6 mana 7/7 Menace Vigilance. When it enters, other creatures you control get +2/+2, gain Menace and Vigilance on a turn, and damage can't be prevented. Shout out the One Ring. So I do think it's kind of interesting that you could play like an elemental strategy, some kind of cheap aggro strategy, and then for 4 mana get like a Craterhoof Behemoth type effect. Much weaker than Craterhoof Behemoth. It itself doesn't have haste. I think this is probably not good enough. I do like that this card is kind of hard castable, though. I do like that this card is kind of hard castable. I'm going to keep an eye on it. I probably will not play this post-release, but I might get some inspiration, and we'll see. Okay, so I was also going to talk about this one a little bit, Sabsunin Lux Embodied. I don't know. I just don't think this card is going to make it. I thought maybe you could play a 1/of as a Green Sun target sometimes. It is an indestructible, blocks Oculus if you have an odd number of counters. I just never mind. Just forget about this one. But I don't know. Thank you for watching. This was a very fun video to make. I'm very excited to start brewing with Aetherdrift cards. Let me know if there's anything you think I missed in the comments. Just normal outro stuff. Love you. Thank you. Bye.